The 1980s were an amazing decade to be a kid, and a big part of that were the fantastical, iconic, and often, in hindsight, deeply traumatizing children's films released during the decade. Today's kids will never know the thrill of waiting months to finally see a film on VHS, only to be emotionally and spiritually wrecked when some horror befalls the hero or heroine within the first 20 minutes. That was the 80s! But we can talk about how those foundational film moments turned us into the completely normal and well-adjusted adults we all are now. Right? Right? So join us as the great pop culture debate tries to determine the best 1980s children's film of all time. My Truffle Shuffle brings all the boys to the yard. I'm your host, Eric Rezsnyak. Please help me welcome my supersized panel for this episode. He survived the swamps of sadness to be with us today. It's Bob Erlenback.
Eric, you're sinking. Eric, fight against the sadness. Eric!
There it is. My childhood trauma. Back again. Don't feed him after midnight. He has acid reflux. Please welcome to the podcast, Brendan Hay.
Eric, I should tell you that I hate podcasts. When I was 9, my dad tried to surprise me by dressing up as a podcast host and...
So that was the smell from your chimney. Got it. Moving on. Thanks, Brendan. Jim Czadzeck, have you ever danced with the devil in the pale moonlight?
That's funny. That's what I ask all of my prey.
Oh, Jim, you're such a joker. And finally, she got fancy and put on her original head for today's podcast. It's Kate Racculia.
You know, you're not beautiful, you understand, but you have a certain prettiness different from my other heads. I believe I'll lock you in the tower for a few years, and when you're old enough, I'll take it.
You know, as an adult, I now have a greater appreciation for Mombi, whose head game is truly unparalleled. What a lifelong icon.
No complaints.
No complaints. So, before we get into the debate, how does this work? We made a poll of dozens of notable films that released in American theaters between 1980 and 1989. We were broad in our interpretation of kids' film. Some were explicitly made for children. Others were films geared towards the whole family, but with kid-friendly tie-ins. More than 75 people took the poll. We tallied their votes, ranked their picks by popularity, and added them to a bracket. Now we argue about it and insult each other, all for your amusement. Want to play along at home? You can. Head to greatpopculturedebate.com and go to polls and brackets. There you'll find the downloadable listener bracket for this and every episode of our little show. Do your picks match up with ours? Do you think we should phone home and get a clue? Let us know by dropping a comment on this episode at our website or by yelling at us on social media. And lastly, if you're curious about how we went from the top 32 down to the Sweet 16, become a Patreon supporter of our podcast. Our Patreons at the $5 level or higher get exclusive access to the warm-ups part ones for each episode, in which we work our way through all of the round one decisions. It's like a whole bonus episode for each topic, and it includes arguments you will not hear anywhere else. And it's only one of our great Patreon perks, so consider supporting us on Patreon today. As an aside, for this episode in particular, I highly recommend you go and check out part one. It is, first of all, the debates are very intense, great arguments, and already I think we've referenced 4 films in our intros that have already been knocked out. So I highly recommend, if you haven't usually listened to the part ones, this is one to do it. Also, because things changed so radically in part one than what I figured, the script for this one is really loose. So just kind of roll with it. With that out of the way, let's make like Eddie Valiant and get on to the case of these debates. Speaking of Detective Valiant, first up, it's ultimate number 1 seed Who Framed Roger Rabbit up against 4 seed Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Jim, make like Judge Doom and make a ruling for Roger Rabbit. Bob, I turn to you to magnify the chances of Shrunk, and I'm going to have Jim go first.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way. She was playing patty cake? Oh, Jessica, please tell me it's not true. Please tell me, Eddie, is that a rabbit in your pocket, or are you just happy to see me? It's such a good film. I think the film itself is such a brilliant world building. It's an introduction for kids into the film noir genre and a style parody. There's this excitement of interconnected universes. Before that was just IP that happened all the time. And I'd say an introduction to the concept of like pop culture Easter eggs, getting the references to this movie. You could watch it multiple times and not catch everything that's hidden in this film. So I think that's like, in terms of development, I think that's all of us nerds loving all those things. I think that it has that baked into there just by itself. Is it a children's film. No, it's adult themes. The book, I suppose, is even more explicit, but it's an adult themes with cartoon jokes over deeper, darker elements. It perhaps a family film might qualify. Also, the cartoon era references people of that time were closer to Bob Haskins' age in the film, like a Betty Boop and Looney Tunes and things like that, back to the 30s and 40s. Sorry, I'm arguing against the thing that I'm talking about. But I'm saying, to some extent, I'm saying I want to do a huge shout out to the Chip and Dale movie that just came out recently. It's basically a modern day spiritual sequel to Roger Rabbit with all of those things, and maybe it's even more kid friendly than this film noir murder and sexual innuendo filled Roger Rabbit. But the cartoon references are more up to date. They're from the 80s and 90s, like 30 or 40 years ago. Great world.
But I was going to say, Jim, in the 80s, those references that you're critiquing for being too old were equally as old as the Rescue Rangers are now.
I know.
Which is a total mind F. Like, let's just acknowledge that. But yeah.
I need to be reminded that I am 80% dust.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Someone pointed out the other day, Madonna's heyday was closer to the 1950s than it was closer to now.
Shut your whore mouth.
Yep. Yep.
They're old.
So I'm sorry, Jim, go ahead.
No, and I kind of bring all that up. I know it's a half argument for it, but I think it has all those the cartoon, the world, the idea that what if all these cartoons I watched as a kid were all interconnected and lived in the same town, and that's such a cool idea, right? But yeah, I also think, as we said in part one, which everyone should check out, a lot of it has to do with when you've seen it. So I think the new Chip and Dale movie will be that for my kids to some extent, more than Roger Rabbit will be for them.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so we have two members of this panel who have kids. Jim, Brendan, have any of your children seen Roger Rabbit?
No, that they have watched Chip and Dale. So I'm actually going to switch my vote to Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers.
Yes, I do that too.
Perfect. Bob, do you want to talk a little bit about Honey, I Shrunk the Kids?
Yeah, I think everything that Jim just said about Roger Rabbit is true. And I think it is a fantastic movie. And I think that Roger Rabbit really took filmmaking and the style that it was doing, and with the animation and mixed with the live action, it took it to the next level. Disney's been doing that since the beginning of time, right? With Bedknobs and Broomsticks or Mary Poppins, they've merged those two things together, and Who Framed did that, right? And it did it to the nth degree. But I think, to Jim's point, his own point of saying it's not really a children's movie, right? It is a great movie, and I think we all look fondly on it and have a really good, we really think highly of this film for those reasons. And it is that, what if all of our cartoons live together in a world? Those are all really great and cool ideas. When I talk about Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, it brings me into, as I talked about a lot in round one, please listen to round one on Patreon. The rubric that I was looking at is it has those hallmarks of what a 80s kids film are, at least in the way that I'm looking at it and applying it to this bracket. It has kids, first of all, live action kids, children that we related to at the time, being that age and seeing that film. Something incredible happens to them, something that could never happen, and your mind is completely blown, oh my God, what a cool invention. And to even be an inventor is super cool, and to see that they got shrunk and they go through all of these different adventures throughout their house, their lawn, whatever. It's really kind of that fun adventure, and it has all of those kind of 80s kind of elements there. I think Honey, I Shrunk the Kids was coming towards the tail end of the 80s, so it started to bleed into some of the 90s, so that might be a knock on it for this bracket, perhaps. But to me, it's more the children's film, and it more fits into some of the tropes and the things that we think of when we're talking about these types of movies for us as children in the 80s. So that's where I am with Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Brendan, where are you on this one?
Torn. I actually really agree with that logic on Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. I think that it is the more kid-friendly film, without a doubt. That said, as a kid who saw Roger Rabbit as a kid, it stayed with me forever. I mean, I can say that was my entryway to a sense of humor, that kind of like, it was building off of like, if the Muppets got me primed for subversive humor, this was a next level of it. And just again, as Jim, as you said, the concept of like, oh my God, there's this interconnected world where all of them playing, like that was a sandbox I never wanted to stop playing in. So yeah, just for me, it's like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, I look at it as like something that made me want to do what I do today. So I'm going to go with Roger.
Kate.
I also have to go with Roger, even though absolutely Honey, I Shrunk the Kids has more of a child's point of view. But Who Framed Roger Rabbit is a watermark, landmark,
Landmark, watershed. Yes.
Landmark. In film. And it came out kind of in the middle of the 80s. It was this huge Warner Brothers, Looney Tunes, and Disney playing together, right? Like that was massive. And that's why Bugs Bunny and Mickey are always in the same scene together, right? Because they had to have the exact same amount of screen time. So like as a representative of like the baby corporate synergy of the 80s is now our entire media landscape. Like I feel like it's there, but also as a kid, this movie completely inflamed my brain. Its darkness, its noirness, its sort of alternate history. Like this movie completely opened up my brain to what kinds of stories were possible. I freaking loved it. And when I killed your brother, Eddie, I looked like this. Sorry, it's late. I didn't mean to hurt you all.
That's okay. She did. She did mean that. Here's my thing. You pointed out that it's very dark and subversive and there's a lot of adult themes in it. But when I watched it as a kid, I don't know, like I didn't get
accessible.
Like 90% of that.
Super accessible. No, it doesn't scare you. It's it's very, very accessible to you.
I mean, Judge Doom at the end is terrifying, and
when he kills the shoe.
Oh, that's the most traumatizing part there. Yep, that poor shoe.
Trauma is a core part of 80s children's cinema.
Exactly.
This is something that you need to embrace right now as part of this episode. Like that is an actual rubric a lot of us are putting towards this. Like, did this film traumatize me in a very real, compelling way? And it did. But like, I'm going to actually liken it to The Simpsons, where like watching The Simpsons as a kid, there were a lot of jokes that I just didn't understand, but I still loved and watched The Simpsons as a kid. Then you go back and you watch those early seasons as an adult and you're like, whoa, like the Ayn Rand School for Tots. Like as a child, I had no idea what that was referencing. As an adult, I was like, oh, that's really funny. So I feel like Roger Rabbit does the same thing, except it also has like the noir stuff I completely went over my head as a kid. Jessica Rabbit I knew was sexy, but like it didn't seem lascivious to me, even though she is like a full-on pinup. So yeah, it's arguably an adult film, but the humor, I don't know how they pulled it off. Frankly, it's a tightrope act. It never felt filthy or really aggressive. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong there. All that to say, I'm voting for Roger Rabbit. So sorry, Bob.
That's all right. I'm switching to Roger Rabbit.
Are you really?
Yeah, I was just fighting for Honey for fun.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Next up, it looks like 3-seed Raiders of the Lost Ark is getting flattened by the runaway boulder that is 7-seed Flight of the Navigator. Do any of our panelists want to make a last-ditch effort to extend Indiana Jones's arc of the Covenant? Yes.
I'll jump in if nobody else will.
Yeah, take it. Go on, take everything I want you to.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Raiders, it's Indiana Jones. Going back to, yes, Indiana Jones was very much not made for children. However, we all saw it as children, and at least for myself, wanted to be Indiana Jones. Like, that was just one of the most exciting playtime things as a kid. Like, this is a film that lived on in your brain long after, and not just because the face melting replayed every time you closed your eyes. It was just something that stayed with you for, like, this, I don't know, he's an iconic hero of the 80s to kids, whether he should be or not. Also, again, I'm also partially doing this. I'll do it one more time in these brackets. I just don't have any real nostalgia or fondness for the other film. I think I just probably did need to rewatch it once since that drive-in for Flight of the Navigator, but I'm still Raiders.
So for those who did not listen to part one, this was a highly contentious debate between, and I want you to take a moment, if you're driving, pull off to the side of the road. It was Flight of the Navigator, a 7-seed, up against E.T., a 2 seed. And our panel voted overwhelmingly to advance Flight of the Navigator over E.T. I'll give you a moment. Okay, so I actually do believe that there was good arguments for it. I think it was done in good faith.
Yes.
I think that there were really compelling reasons for it, mostly being the fact that the Flight of the Navigator is a children's film made specifically for children, not for family, not for parents. It is made for kids, whereas E.T. is an adult nostalgic view of childhood. And I think that's such a great complex argument. To me, it's wild that it is currently poised to roll on to round 3. But that being said, I don't think Raiders of the Lost Ark either deserves to be in the round 3 of a children's debate.
No, it's fair.
I say this like, I think, I mean, you want to talk about nostalgia. Indiana Jones is a pulp nostalgic, right? The 80s was highly referential of the 50s. This is very much a 50s comic book character come to life, and even possibly earlier than that, going back to the pulps of the 20s, whatever.
30s, 40s, yeah.
But in terms of being a kids film, I don't think Raiders really.
No.
They had Indiana Jones toys, which is why we left it on this bracket. I swear to you, that is the honest to God truth. There were kids toys. There were cups,
movie tie-in novelizations, storybooks, everything.
Whipping action.
Yeah, exactly. The whipping action, which I wish I'd picked up more. We could have used that as an adult. But no, I think it's fine being here. But I think of the two, I'm actually going to advance Flight of the Navigator. Everybody else is on Flight of the Navigator.
I am.
Compliance.
And I literally watched Temple of Doom, and which I think of all of the indie movies, probably ironically is the one you could make the most argument for, in that it contains a child's point of view because short round.
Sure.
It is the worst of them.
Yeah.
I loved it as a child. And oh god, I'll talk about Sexual Awakening. Harrison Ford is so in that movie.
Oh my god,
it's absurd. I don't know if he's ever looked hotter except in Working Girl, and that's a totally different kind of hot.
It's peak hotness for Harrison Ford for sure.
But it is not a children's movie, especially Raiders, I think. Yeah.
It's probably the least of the 3, yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is. But yeah, Flight of the Navigator meant a lot to me as a young person. It's a great movie, and it's got one of the earliest what's that effect, the sort of silver morphing effect for the spaceship. It's pretty great. So yes.
And a young Sarah Jessica Parker just cutting her teeth and acting.
Stop taking my future round arguments away from me.
Sorry, forget about that. It never happened. You never heard it. Next, in a battle of more family film than kid films, it's 1 seed Ghostbusters versus 5 seed Return of the Jedi. Kate, explain why there is no Dana, but there is success for Ghostbusters, not Goatbusters. That's a completely different setup. Bob, pick it for Wicked and the success of Jedi. I'm going to have Bob go first.
Yeah, I think Pick It for Wicked is a really great segue into this argument, because I think of these two films, yes, I think Return of the Jedi and the Star Wars films in general, they're geared towards children. They're intended towards children. We made some really terrific arguments in round 1. Again, this is probably the most I've ever referenced round 1 in any of our round 2 and 3 arguments before. But going back and listening to that is really, really interesting and compelling, in my opinion, when it comes to George Lucas's vision for these films, from 1 to 6. It was really intended for children, and he wanted to entertain children. We certainly embrace them and continue to carry them through from nostalgia's sake, and they are bigger than life at this point and something completely different. But Return of the Jedi absolutely is for kids. You can't deny the C-3PO and R2-D2, the droids, being for kids. The Ewoks are aggressively for children. To be able to
cuddly. I had so many stuffed Ewoks.
Yeah, to be able to spawn the Ewoks Caravan of Courage in the Ewok movie, available on Disney Plus.
Terrible.
They are so bad.
They're so bad.
So fun to watch. So they're very much for kids. The merchandise of these films. I think there's some arguments for Ghostbusters. I'm not going to make them. That are some obviously have the merchandise and some of the other kind of of parts of that franchise and things like that. But to talk about the staying power of this kids franchise for all of these years and still to be so revered and thought so fondly of by children, I don't know as though people are still showing Ghostbusters to their kids. At this point, I know I would, but so I think that's really, for me, if you're going to split it between these two, Ghostbusters is just a little too mature for me. Yeah, she sleeps above the covers, 4 feet above the covers, but that doesn't get me there. And I mean, where do these stairs go? they go up, but not on this argument.
So I do want to pause before I go to Kate and ask the two parents on our panel: have any of your children watched either Ghostbusters or Return of the Jedi?
Yeah, I have 6-year-old twins. They have seen Return of the Jedi. They have not seen Ghostbusters. They are aware of the concept of Ghostbusters from toys and things like that, but basically we're choosing to keep it at that for now. Versus, they've watched all 3 original Star Wars films. I will say Return of the Jedi actually was the biggest extremes of they wanted no scene that had Jabba at all. But then they have rewatched the back half of Jedi probably 5 times.
Anything on Endor?
Yeah, anything on Endor, and they're even fine with the Emperor fight because it gets to a happy ending, so they're fine with that.
Yeah. Okay. And what about you, Jim?
Hey, I'll say my kids are waiting to watch Kenobi. So we've watched all the Star Wars, a lot of it. And I think you guys know, I'm a huge fan of Ghostbusters, but I'm still waiting to show it to them. So I think that kind of says it there.
Yeah.
This is a very interesting. So Kate, I do want you to make your argument, but I think this is actually really relevant data. So just Kate, the floor is yours.
Ghostbusters, what to say? It is not a children's movie.
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Is it one of the movies that absolutely defined my childhood? Other than what is my ultimate number one, honestly, it's that movie and Ghostbusters. The quality of the film is, the effects are tremendous. The music is great. It is one of the best New York movies, right? It's old, dirty New York, filmed on location. It is comedy, high concept, lightning in a bottle. And I think that high concept thing, right, was what was so appealing and accessible to kids. Talk about merchandising, toys, action figures, figurines, still. The cartoon, which is excellent. Ecto Cooler, which I don't know if I've ever even drunk.
Oh my God. It's delicious.
Yeah, it's so good.
I picked it up as an adult. There's nothing wrong with it.
There's nothing wrong with
it. It's lime and tangerine, I think. That's what those are the flavors.
Ooh. So, boy, is this movie's legacy convoluted, which I think you could say actually makes it highly culturally relevant. Is it, in fact, the best 80s kids movie that represents the corrosive toxicity of nostalgia? Maybe. A lot of stuff doesn't hold up. I understand why you're waiting to show it to your kids, right? The EPA is the bad guy. And I mean, it unleashed a storm of misogynist bullshit, right? When the All Ladies Ghostbusters came out. God. It's like a lightning rod, you know? And Venkman, God, I love Bill Murray, but he is kind of a creep to Sigourney Weaver. He just is. And
from the opening scene, he's kind of a creep. Again, love the movie. He's hilarious in it, but such
a creep. Such a creep. In a way where you're that's not cool. You rogue. That's not cool. But it's such a good movie, and there's so much weird, iconic, Gozer cooking the eggs on the counter in her kitchen, that kind of stuff. My relationship with this movie, so my rubric was is there a child point of view? Is the point of view of the movie a child's point of view? What is sort of the cultural legacy? What is the quality of the film itself? What is my relation to it? I fucking love this movie. I remember my parents going on a date to see it and me being pissed that they left me behind. I had a sticker book with a freaking terror dog on the cover. I remember one time watching it. So this was on the tape with Return to Oz, which was the tape that I watched the most as a child. I remember tabulating how many swears there were by character and Egon's comparatively low profanity count, because I was such a morally uptight child, validated my intense preference for him as a child. Hail Egon. It informed so many of my own stories and daydreams as a kid, right? That the world is creepy and mysterious, that there's something else beyond what we know. I haven't seen Afterlife, but I am precisely its audience, and I will probably love it and kind of resent that it's pushing all my damn buttons. But Ghostbusters was my childhood in a way that is not toxic. Ghostbusters was for me, people, but maybe not because I was a child.
I will say I loved Afterlife. I thought it was really, really charming.
Yeah. I'm sure. And the fact that it's Egon's kid and it's a girl, like, I'm just going to have feelings about that. Like, I know.
Yeah. Okay.
Can we raise a glass to William Atherton? You know, the 80s douchebag.
One of the best.
My name is Peck.
The reason he's the enemy in that film is because he has no dick.
Exactly. That's true, sir. This man has no penis. All right. So this is
in the whatever it is precinct are bleeding.
Tell him about the Twinkie.
All right. We've got Kate's very good argument. Very good argument. We also have a very good argument for Return of the Jedi, and I think we have very good data from our parents about, not ready for the kids for Ghostbusters. Brandon, were you on this one?
Between film designed by a man for children versus film that came out of just Dan Aykroyd's coke years and theories on the supernatural, I love Ghostbusters. I'm going Jedi.
Okay, Jim.
Same here. Same exact thing. I can just repeat what he said.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
No, go ahead, Kate.
I was just going to say, I'll stick with Ghostbusters just because I love you, Egon. I love you, Harold Ramis. But yeah, definitely Return of the Jedi should move forward.
Yeah, it's hard, right? It's hard.
But also, I feel like it moving forward represents Star Wars as like a cultural
for sure,
right? Yeah,
for sure. It is the stand-in for, I think, all Star Wars. But as I said before, I think Jedi is the most kid-friendly of the three original, with the exception of Jabba, which is nightmare fuel for any age. But yeah, there you go. And I do think that Star Wars was such an integral part of the 80s childhoods that, like, we didn't even, like, we weren't huge 80s kids. We were huge 80s kids. We weren't huge Star Wars figure collectors, and we still somehow had Luke's land speeder. I don't know how that happened.
It just happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
You move to the suburbs, you get it.
Exactly. They hand it out. All right. Next up, it's Catch of the Day versus No Eating at Night, as 3-seed Little Mermaid is currently leading over 2-seed Gremlins. Bren, cuddle with Gizmo and sell us on Gremlins. I will go Under the Sea with Ariel and Little Mermaid. Brendan, go first.
Okay, so first, full disclosure, I am on the Gremlins payroll. I am making a Gremlins show. I have been doing so for 3 years. Gizmo is my boss. So first off, I ask you all to consider, do you want me to be fired by a Mogwai? So please weigh that my well-being and my family's food could depend on your vote. But as I said in the Patreon, I really do feel like Gremlins, while being a film for all ages or a family film, I think it actively was designed by Chris Columbus and Joe Dante to some degree as a kid's first horror movie. It is structured as starting in like the totally cute kind of like, kid and adorable creature film, and just gradually gets darker and gorier, but without ever losing kid point of view and kid-friendly elements, whether it is, to repeat myself slightly from Patreon, mom kicking ass, and it's the most horrifying sequence in the film, but it's mom kicking ass on your behalf, or going to the bar sequence, which I haven't mentioned yet, which is, Gremlins going wild, but they're going wild breakdancing, and in my favorite gag, using puppets with each other. Like, they're just utterly ridiculous still. So it's like they're committing horrible acts that are terrifying, but they're also so funny and adorable. And going back to the parent argument, I've shown all but all but 2 scenes of Gremlins to my kids, and they love it. I will say I have censored the full carnage of the kitchen sequence, and for Santa secrecy related reasons, I've skipped the Kate monologue.
You let them see an old lady flying through the window, though.
Oh, sure. Okay. Again, as I said in the Patreon, it's okay because she was a dick.
She was.
Holly Holiday.
And they had one of those electric chairs at our church when I used to actually have a soul, and I would only think about, like, remember that time in Gremlins where that little bitch got thrown through that window? Every time I saw it.
Every time I've ever seen it.
Yeah. So excellent arguments. And I love Gremlins. It's a touchstone for me. I was Gizmo as one of my like prized Halloween costumes, had the plushies, the whole deal. But I think we have to weigh into the fact that like it's a Little Mermaid, which is like the reason Disney didn't go bankrupt, first of all. So you have to weigh that cultural importance. But it's funny, Brendan said this movie never really resonated with him, whereas this resonated with me on a whole other level than any Disney movie had before it. And I don't know, I won't say after it, but like, because Beauty and the Beast gave me Gaston. But this, I mean, it's a great film. It's taking, the old Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, very much whitewashing it. But you have, I mean, Ariel's kind of a nothing burger of a protagonist. Let's be honest.
She's the first Disney princess with red hair.
She is the first. She's also the first Disney princess to, like, her whole plot line is, I signed a contract, but I'm a rich little girl, so I can get out of it, and my daddy will take care of it.
She was a minor. She needed her father present to sign that contract.
The minors were in Snow White, not in Little Mermaid. No,
you're right.
But I think, if nothing else, my argument for Little Mermaid is amazing music, first of all, and kids' films did have to have a good soundtrack. I think every single one still in this had an awesome soundtrack, or at least a great song involved in it. Great music there, and it has an amazing, compelling villain in Ursula. I can't dismiss her. She's amazing. I've already said she's amazing, but like, if I'm going to weigh the two, which one is more important to the 80s overall as a decade to kids? I think I give it to The Little Mermaid, even though I adore Gremlins. Bob, where are you?
Can I make a counter argument first?
You can, absolutely.
One, for Gremlins' contribution to 80s soundtracks. Let us not forget.
This is true.
And also, I will go to, for the parent thing, my wife and I actively are not showing our kids Little Mermaid because the takeaway for children is horrible in that film. The morality of Little Mermaid is super fucked up, from the entitled rich thing that was already mentioned to, totally give away all your free will and voice to try to catch a dude you just saw on a boat. So versus, I will say, Gremlins ultimately is about a bunch of white folks who realize they didn't respect another culture's rules and pay the fucking price.
Or alternately, if the message is buy American. But I think no, but in all seriousness, like, that is a great point. But what is more 80s than morally bankrupt lessons for children in films?
Specifically for girls.
Specifically for girls.
You have me there. I won't argue.
Yeah.
All right, sorry, go on.
No, you're good. These are excellent back and forth. This is exactly what we're here to do on the Great Pop Culture Debate. Bob, where are you on this one?
So I don't know if Jim's going to say this or not, but I'm taking it. I recently was able to watch Gremlins with his children, and we just made the argument previously about Ghostbusters and not showing that yet. And we did watch Gremlins, and there were some intense parts and things like that. But thinking about Brendan's argument in round one and just now too, like, there was the parts of that movie where they giggled and they thought it was funny, and it brought it back down to their level. And I saw that happening. When we talk about merch and toys, you've got the gizmos, you've got the toys with Gremlins and all of those pieces. I'm sure that Little Mermaid has toys, and I'm sure they were marketed to a very specific population of the country, and not the other population of the country. So I'm not sure that the toys have that much resonance in this argument when it comes to The Little Mermaid. I love The Little Mermaid. Everything you said about it is true. You know that I'm a Disney stan from beginning to end, even though that they're evil at times, right? I love it. It is the tail end of the 80s. I know it's still within the 80s, but it's 89. And I'm going to guess, I haven't looked back on it, I bet you it's the end or towards the end, maybe even like November, December of 89.
Yep.
So it's practically 90s.
Sure.
I think
it's November 89. Yep.
I talked about this a lot in round one, and it came down to, like, animation almost gets a pass in my mind a little bit. It's just like, yes, it's for kids. Obviously, it's an animated film. There are adult animated films, but they're not like this, right? And there's so much more of it from a critical mass of animation, right? So I don't lean towards the animations for these, because I'm really going back to that kind of 80s children film and those pieces that really resonate with me with regards to what defined those for me. And I talked about this previously as well. Like there's that shaggy filmmaking quality to some of these films from the 80s that feel kind of, under the radar. And like, I can't believe I'm watching this. And that's kind of the Gremlins feel, right? It's a little bit grittier and dirtier. And it's like, should I be watching this? Maybe I shouldn't be, right? But I am, because I'm a kid and I do things, right? Everybody watches Little Mermaid, and why wouldn't you? So that's where I'm with Gremlins.
You're with Gremlins. Okay. Jim.
I think a lot of good arguments have been made for Gremlins, but I can't deny that the Little Mermaid really brought Disney into this new era. That idea, bringing back, they hadn't done a fairy tale story since Sleeping Beauty in 1959.
Is that true?
Yeah, and they had, and then it followed with Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King, Hercules, Mulan, all kind of setting the form, the mold of that Renaissance era of Disney. And so, as I said earlier, in the other part, it may not resonate with me myself as much as Gremlins does, but I'm voting for the listeners. So I'm gonna go with Little Mermaid.
Very magnanimous of you, Jim. Kate?
I get to be the tiebreaker?
You're the tiebreaker.
Wow. Oh my God, stunning. I don't know, someone. I'm going to go with Gremlins.
Ooh, I love it. I love it.
So here's my rationale. 80s. Little Mermaid is only 80s on a technicality. It isn't even representative of what Disney was doing in the 80s. In fact, it is the opposite of what Disney was in the 80s, right? Like Don Bluth was animation in the 80s, which is why he's all over this bracket, right? So, and Gremlins as that like weird is for kids. Like your arguments are so good, Brendan. Like Gremlins, I didn't see Gremlins until later. And I love horror movies, but I don't think I would have been ready for like baby's first horror movie for me really was like Scream. That was when I was like ready for like a real actual horror movie. Although
I was just say Return to Oz in the Patreon.
I was going to say like
qualifies.
That also is baby's first horror movie, as is Temple of Doom.
Yeah.
So, but like I like that kind of chaotic horror. Like I didn't like the chaotic horror of Beetlejuice either. But it is 80s. That is the 80s vibe, right? Like, and it is puppets, and it is a cartoon, and it is for kids, and it is also effing terrifying, which is what an 80s children film needs to do.
Yep, it's a great point. Great point. So Gremlins advances, and actually it was a higher seed than Little Mermaid, just FYI.
Eric,
next,
do you mind if I say goodbye to Little Mermaid in song?
Please.
Maybe there's something the matter with me. I just don't see how a world that makes such wonderful things like Little Mermaid could be bad. Look at this film. Isn't it neat? Without it, no Disney film is complete. Collection is complete. Even if you were the girl who had every children's film, this film is a trove of treasures untold. How many wonders does this film hold? Watching it again, you think the film's got everything. It's got music and comedy aplenty. It's got wholesome Disney-ness galore. You want thingamabobs? It's got plenty. And by thingamabobs, I mean elements that set the standard for a new age of Disney films that became instant classics. No big deal.
He went there.
I want more. This film is where the people are. You get to see them. You get to see them dancing. They're walking around on those, what do you call them? Oh, feet. Every kid wished they could be part of that world.
You did it, Jim.
He brought the receipts on that one.
He did. He did. I was going to make a thingamabobs joke saying we have one thingamabob. He's on the panel, but he didn't vote for World. So, all right, we are moving on. Gremlins, thank you for that serenade, Jim. Very well done. Next up, 4-seed Muppets Take Manhattan seems poised to call pest control on Disney's Great Mouse Detective. And 8-seed has a new piece of evidence spun this case in an entirely new direction for anyone. Is anyone going to switch their vote, or do I have
I'm going to switch my vote to Muppets Take Manhattan because I previously had voted for Willow in the first, so I'm happy to go Muppets.
All right.
I'm also going Muppets.
Jim?
Muppets.
Bob? All right. Then it's unanimous. I do think that Kate made a great point that actually the Great Mouse Detective, Oliver and Company, The Rescuers Down Under, I think those are all the other, and Fox and the Hound.
Black Cauldron. Yep.
Are actually more, are more reflective of the Disney 80s output than I would say that Little Mermaid is.
Yep.
It's not great, but I think actually if we look back on it now, you can see like it was actually a really interesting time for their animation. It just wasn't popular. So
yeah, and I love The Great Mouse Detective. Is a great movie, and it's a kids movie.
Absolutely, it's worth watching. Yep.
There you go. So check it out on Disney Plus and Black Cauldron. Next, in a battle of 80s kids movie juggernauts, it's 2-seed Goonies versus 3-seed Labyrinth. God help us. Bob, explain why you're the babe with the power for Labyrinth. Kate, make like Steph and babysit us without getting paid and steer us towards Goonies. Bob, I'm going to have you go first. And I will say before we start in this could easily be a final 2 matchup for this entire episode.
I mean, it actually should be,
Yeah. It's just here we are. Bob, what do you got?
Yeah, the Labyrinth, I'm probably pushing a very heavy rock up a hill in this matchup with the crowd that I'm with. But when it comes to the Labyrinth, there are elements of the Labyrinth that let me say, I just love both of these films a ton. Like, they're very much part of my 80s. You are 100% correct, Eric, in saying that they should be final 2. Where I edged out Labyrinth in this matchup at this time was just I felt as though it kind of introduced some some fantasy elements to the audience, to the kids. It was able to introduce David Bowie with an amazing soundtrack. Goonies has a great song in it, but from a soundtrack perspective, I don't think it holds up the same as it would in Labyrinth. I think that there's some more kind of 80s pieces with regards to that. It's, again, I don't know as though I have a ton to say because I could probably argue both sides of the fence on this one. To me, I think it really kind of did some things that were really interesting with live action and puppets. I think it's a really good blending of those two things. I mean, I think that's really where I am with Labyrinth right now, and that's where I'll leave it. I'll let Kate fly at this point.
Yeah, I will say before Kate gets in, like, when you're talking about the artistry of filmmaking, it's really hard to find any fault in Labyrinth, like across the board. It is a magnum opus. Yeah. But that being said, if we're talking about best 80s children's film, Kate, Goonies.
I mean, so I haven't prepared anything. I'm just speaking off the cuff, but like, it's impossible for me to even kind of understand what my childhood movie going would have been if not for the Goonies. Like, this movie, immediately accessible to children, even though the kids, I think it came out in 85. So I probably saw it 86 maybe on video. And the kids were all like, I would guess they were like 12, 13, right? Like, they're around that age.
Sure.
But they're accessible and they're having a kid-sized adventure and they're saving their family from foreclosure by going on a treasure hunt to find a pirate's treasure. Like, right, what is more kind of like kid adventure than that? But it is very 80s. There's like the weird element of the Fratellis is this like creepy family trying to hunt the kids down. There's that incredible, I'm just like spitballing now because there's a scene of like Chunk. They're torturing Chunk by like trying to stick his hand in the vinegar, which is like such a like, in a kids movie, yes, it was the 80s, and it's an absolutely incredible scene. And if you want me to do the entire monologue, talk. I glued my uncle's toupee on my place to play Moses in my Hebrew school play. Like, it's just,
I pushed my sister down the stairs trying to like this kid.
It's so clever. The screenplay is so great. The actors, the child actors are fantastic. You kind of have to see this as a kid because I remember showing it to friends in college and they're like, when would these children stop screaming? And I'm like, that's the point. Like, it is a movie that is immediately accessible for kids, but like is directed by Richard Donner from a screenplay by Chris Columbus, which I have read and which is not as good as the actual movie. Richard Donner made some good cuts. It's much goofier. The screenplay is much more comic and goofy. Based on a story by Steven Spielberg, right? That sort of triumvirate of like 80s filmmaking powerhouses. It's a well-made movie too, right? The sets are incredible. The pirate ship is unbelievable. It's just, it is when you like, there's no other movie like this. And I think there's a reason why they keep talking about rebooting it and it doesn't happen, right? Because this is just lightning in a bottle. Perfect 80s children's movie.
We are getting the quasi spinoff on Disney Plus series.
What?
But you're not aware of this?
It's not. Yeah, but it's like more of it's a show about loving Goonies than actually Goonies.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
See,
So-
that makes sense. That makes sense.
All right. I don't want to belabor the point because I have a feeling it's going to go on, and we want to save some stuff for rounds 3 and 4.
I'm switching my vote to Goonies.
Jim, where are you on this?
I agree that these could both face off at the end if it were played out a different way. But yes, Goonies is the way I'm going.
Brendan.
I love Labyrinth, but I think I am going to ultimately go Goonies as well. Although I want to call out Labyrinth for also having being a wonderful sexual awakening for any and all with both Jennifer Connelly and David Bowie.
Indeed.
Yes.
Indeed.
And I will not tell the story that I've told on this podcast multiple times about my niece's David Bowie experience. But I will just say that this actually pains me because I like of all the movies we watched as kids, like Labyrinth and Goonies, I feel like are like two of the ones we watched the most.
Mm-hmm.
And Kate made such an interesting point. Like you did need to see Goonies when you were a kid. Otherwise it doesn't
100%.
work at all.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I feel like anyone could watch Labyrinth now, regardless of age, and appreciate this is a beautiful movie with amazing music. It's a great fairy tale. Like it's an original fairy tale that's executed really, really well. The special effects in it and the practical effects in it are incredible. So I actually think it's more accessible, but I think ultimately that is why, to wrap it back around, Goonies has to win here because you had to see it when you were an 80s kid. Yeah. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So I think we are unanimous, even though it pains me to move Goonies forward. Well, it doesn't pain me to move Goonies forward. It pains me to lose Labyrinth. Next up, it's 1 seed Neverending Story versus 4 seed Great Muppet Caper. I want to go around before we start talking about this. Is anyone voting for Great Muppet Caper over Neverending Story here?
Not anymore. Now that I want to back a Muppet movie through this, so I'm happy to back the
Manhattan.
Muppet. Yeah, Manhattan.
Okay. Kate?
Nope. I am full on Neverending Story.
Yeah, same.
Jim?
Same thing. I'm happy to see a Muppet movie move forward, so we don't need to.
Yep. Bob?
Let me think about this for a second. I'm going to push forward the Neverending Story.
Yeah, and again,
with a big smile on my face.
If you didn't listen to part 1, the Neverending Story was going to go out in round 1, kids, and I got all up in Kate's business. I stepped to her, and no, I'm kidding.
Made some compelling arguments.
Yes, and it was up against.
So you should listen to round 1 and watch Return to Oz. It's a goddamn masterpiece.
Yes, because it was up against Return to Oz, which is an amazing film, but the Neverending Story is for 80s children. So we're going to advance that. And finally, in round 2, 6 seed The Land Before Time versus 7 seed The Secret of Nim. It's a Don Bluth off. Brendan, do you want to talk a little bit about Land Before Time, the kind of Jurassic Park before it was Jurassic Park, but from the dinosaurs' perspective? And I'll talk a little bit about Secret of Nim. Go for it, Bren.
Land Before, I think both, honestly, I just want to see Bluth really represented here.
Yeah.
I think Secret of Nim was more influential. It was first. I think Land Before Time was better. I think actually the Knocked Out in Patreon American Tail was probably his best.
Yep.
But I do think Land Before Time, it was even if you grew up loving dinosaurs, and there weren't as many dinosaur movies back in the 80s, but you read all the books, all that, this was not a dinosaur tale you had seen before. Not just the fact that it was like from the perspective of kid dinosaurs, which as an 80s kid was like an instantly relatable position, but it was also like at the end of the dinosaur run, like it was a really dark, scary, because you could have done the fun, like, hey, this is just dinosaurs being dinosaurs. It's like, no, we are putting you into the toughest times for dinosaurs from a kid who, it's like, let's start by having his mom die and then almost kill all of his friends repeatedly for the next 80 minutes. So it is a fucking tough watch.
Model.
Exactly. But it is another one that I forget which part I said this in, I think it was in the Patreon, where it's like, one of the great things of these 80s movies was it takes a kid slightly to the edge of what they're comfortable with, and then when you do come out on the other side, you actually feel a little stronger, like, hey, I made it through that too. And Land Before Time is one I actively remember that from, because I remember seeing it for a friend's birthday when I was probably about like 9 or 10 years old, and it was that like we were all a little shook, but like eating pizza afterwards, it was all like, can you believe they did all that? Like we all were like kind of like as if it happened to us kind of thing. So I vote for Land Before Time. Plus, again, it spun off 13 sequels, which, kudos to anything that can do that.
Yeah, seriously.
More friends dying.
Well, I don't think any of them ever died. I think they were all fine. They're fine. They're great.
Yeah.
They're
They're
amazing.
dinosaurs, Eric. They all died.
They did. And now they're powering my car. So thanks.
I wouldn't be surprised if sequel number 12 was they all came to present day. Nobody knows for sure.
And BD Wong is there.
I actually don't have a compelling argument for Secret of NIMH after that. To me, what I was thinking when you were talking, Brendan, was that for all of the things the Secret of NIMH did amazing, it's a very audacious film. It's very daring. It's very subversive in a lot of ways. Land Before Time has this tremendous heart to it, and I think it speaks to kids more than Secret of NIMH did, which almost spoke to parents more. I feel like as a kid, Secret of NIMH was kind of hard to follow, and I remember watching it as a kid. I thought it was really beautiful, but I didn't fully understand what was happening. Whereas in Land Before Time, you get it because it's pretty simple. These kids are up the creek and they're just trying to survive. And I guess I'm switching my vote to Land Before Time. I may have always been there, but I'm definitely Land Before Time now. Kate, where are you?
I got to stick with NIMH because it's the one that I saw Land Before Time, and I do think it is technically it's a more advanced achievement. Considering there are only 6 years and an American Tail between those, wow. But NIMH means a lot to me. I really love that movie, so I'm sticking with it.
Jim, NIMH?
Oh no. Land Before Time for me.
And Bob?
Land Before Time.
And you're so passionate about this argument. I really appreciate you taking the time to have succeed.
High takes, low stakes. The stakes could not be lower.
The stakes could not be lower. They're on the floor. And that is the end of round 2. We are going to take a quick break and wish our annoying little brothers into the clutches of the Goblin King. We will be right back after these messages. And we're back for round 3 of our best 80s children's film debate. While we were gone, Kate sold her voice to a sea witch, but now she has legs, so totally worth it. Remember, Kate, don't underestimate the importance of body language. Sorry, that was a terrible Ursula impression, but here we are.
I would say something, but how do I have no voice on a podcast?
I know it doesn't actually work, but I wrote this script at 1:00 in the morning, so we're just going with it.
And you got to say body language.
I did.
You're a mute, dear. Try not to speak.
Before we get into the Elite 8 matchups, I want to ask my panel, how can people find you on social media? Bob, take it away.
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at DisnerdBob.
So that shows you exactly how intense he was that he voted against a Disney movie for this one.
That's true.
And Brendan, how can people find you?
I am on Twitter at B_Hay, Hay.
Great. And you also have a very specific connection to the 80s films. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I alluded to this already, but I am one of the executive producers of the upcoming animated series for HBO Max, Gremlins Secrets of the Mogwai. I've been living and rewatching my pick for the overall winner of this bracket, Gremlins, over and over for the last few years. But I'm really, really excited for everybody to get to see it starting, hopefully in 2023.
And you have some other shows that people can check out now, though, right?
Yes. If you also want to get a sense of what I think is appropriate for your children. I have also in the past run 2 cartoons that are currently streaming on Netflix, Harvey Girls Forever and Dawn of the Croods. Both all available, a whole bunch of stuff, super funny stuff, probably ages 6 to 7 and up.
Perfect. And you do not want me to tell you what I think is appropriate for your children. So we're going to move on to Jim. How can people find you?
On Twitter, at JCCAD.
Great. And Kate?
I am occasionally on Twitter at Kate Racculia, but you can also find pictures of my cats on Instagram at Gomez Rack.
Excellent. And you can find me at Eric Rezsnyak on Twitter and Instagram. That's ERIC, REZ as in zebra, S as in snake, N as in Nancy, YAK. Or you can just message at Great Pop Culture Debate on Insta or at culture_debate on Twitter. Now, with that out of the way, let's move on to round 3 before Mama Fratelli follows those size 5s. Our Elite 8 is as follows: Who Framed Roger Rabbit versus Flight of the Navigator, Return of the Jedi versus Gremlins, Muppets Take Manhattan versus Goonies, Neverending Story versus Land Before Time. I think that's a great Elite 8. I'm very pleased with how this shook out. I think all of those are movies that were quintessential to children in the 1980s, truthfully. With that being said, I want to get into this first matchup. Who Framed Roger Rabbit versus Flight of the Navigator? I'm going to go around the horn. I want you to give me your vote. I'm going to start with Bob.
Flight of the Navigator.
Brendan.
Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
Jim.
Flight of the Navigator.
Kate.
Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
Oh.
It's Roger Rabbit, kids. Like, you have had a great run. You have had a great run for a 7 seed to make it to Elite 8. You should be very pleased with yourself. I'm sure Derek Makita is listening to this. Shout out to Derek, who was very upset he could not be here to argue on behalf of Flight of the Navigator. Bob, you did him proud.
It's okay. If you don't want a true 80s kids film in the Final Four, I'm fine with that.
Well, so am I. So that worked out great.
It was funny. I was blown away that others had a fondness for this film. Like I'd mentioned this about the Oz film too, that it was kind of felt like this indie film that other people didn't know about or didn't like. Yep. And I just kind of held a fondness. We must have recorded off maybe HBO, or was it on the Wonderful?
Did you have
Disney?
the Disney Channel? Because both of these were on the Disney Channel a lot.
They did have that like Saturday afternoon Disney thing too, or something too.
Yeah.
So like it was like I didn't think it was in theaters. I thought it was just a TV movie or something. So and then Bob shared his fondness recently, and other people on the Discord too, which you can join if you're a Patreon sponsor.
Correct.
And I was like, whoa, other people like this. And so I'm happy that I went this far. It's worth it. Maybe it's another one where it's better to see it in the 80s as a child versus seeing it now. Maybe the remake they're making will be for this generation.
Didn't even know they were remaking it.
Yeah, it's been on it. It's been on again, off again.
So this just in, we had ourselves what they call in the industry a technical difficulty. After recording this episode, a good chunk of the audio just poof, vanished. Gone. Can't find it anywhere. The leading suspicion is either gremlins were involved or the nothing came down from Fantasia and gobbled it all up. So everything from this point in the episode was recorded roughly a month and a half later from everything you've already heard. And the panel is trying to reconstruct our arguments from the previous recording. I'm so fascinated to see if we make the same decisions that we did back in July, now that we're in late August. But it's the magic of podcasting, everyone. Enjoy.
Eric, what happens going forward if I get so excited and oops, my bosoms come flying out?
Do you think there are men on this podcast who have not seen your bosoms?
No.
And since that time, the League of Their Own show has also come out. So as you can see, we're in a very highly nostalgic moment. But
it's been so long we've moved from the 80s to the 90s. We can't even help ourselves.
Exactly. And now we have to go back to the 80s. So get in our DeLorean.
And there's something so sort of like, is it synecdoche? I don't know. It's like we are living the experience of what do I remember? Yeah. Do I remember it the way it really was? Or is my nostalgia coloring it?
This is also what you get for hiring Nathan Fielder to edit our episodes.
There you go. But I was go ahead, Bob.
I was saying, and if you want to complain and go back, like we can't go back and right the wrong of the Who Framed Roger Rabbit pick from the first pairing of
I like to think that the original audio fell into dip.
Exactly. It's all gone now. Judge Doom. But no, I was going to say it actually is very much like the Flight of the Navigator in that we've gone into the future now and nothing makes sense. But it's fine. Everything's great. So we're just going to continue forward, and I hope that you all sit back and enjoy our next round 3 matchup. Speaking of Gremlins, it's 2-seed Gremlins up against 5-seed Return of the Jedi. And we're going to go around the horn. I'm going to start. I have no idea who I left off with last time. So let's go alphabetically with Bren. Gremlins or Return of the Jedi?
I love both. I have had the joy of indulging in my childhood as an adult and working on animated stuff for both. Weirdly enough, I'm going to say I'm actually going to let my own kids help make this call and go Gremlins, because my kids have actually been able to watch all of Gremlins minus 2 scenes, granted, which I may have talked about in part 1. I have we jumped past Mom in the Kitchen, and we jumped past Phoebe Cates' Santa monologue. But otherwise, they actually really loved it, found it funny, found Gizmo charming, cute, adorable, all of that. On the flip side, almost the entire front half of Return of the Jedi was nightmare fuel for them.
Sure.
So, yeah, I'm going to go... And again, hard love for Ewoks. Ewoks versus Mogwai is a very tough thing. My childhood was largely defined by wanting to snuggle both, but I'm going Gremlins.
And thank God I grew up to be a gay man who loves bears, because I get to. Why choose? Actually, where is that in like the gay animal chart? We have bears, we have otters, we have wolves. Where's Mogwai? Where's Ewok? Where's Ewok? Yeah. Are Wookiees tall bears? I don't know. We need to figure this out. That's a whole different podcast. All right, so that's one for Gremlins. Next, I think alphabetically, it's Bob. Actually, Bob should have gone first, but Bob, you go now.
That's fine. I'm good. So Return of the Jedi versus Gremlins. What did I pick the first time around? God only knows. Who knows? God only knows. But I was thinking about this as we were preparing to re-record here, right? There's something about Gremlins and there's that Gremlins. We've had Gremlins 2. We have the animated series that's going to come up. Return of the Jedi, the Star Wars thing, it just goes on and on and on and on. But there's something just encapsulating of Gremlins in the 80s that's quintessential 80s. And I think whereas the Star Wars films definitely had that particular film had that, it is part of a bigger thing that kind of isn't of the 80s altogether. So I'm going to go with Gremlins because it really is more representative for me of the 80s.
Yeah, there's a timelessness to the Star Wars universe, whereas the Gremlins do seem firmly cemented in the 80s in my brain. That's an interesting point. Jim?
Well, I think that is interesting, but also if we just think of Star Wars in that time, yes, it's had a bigger life now, but so does I hope to see this wonderful new animated series coming too for Gremlins. This is tough. I think like through the lens of my own kids, they have eaten up all the Star Wars stuff, but they also really enjoyed Gremlins. Gremlins is an interesting introduction to the horror genre, which as I think more about that's the only way my kids would have gotten into that kind of type of film. But for me as a child, and this is terrible, I had Caravan of Courage on VHS or something. And I think I'm going to go with that vote for Return of the Jedi just because of that for myself, but I like them both a lot.
Yeah, this is a great Elite Eight, by the way. I'm looking at it again today. I was like, oh, this is a really good one. Kate?
As a child, I had a full relationship with the Ewoks and Return of the Jedi in particular. I may have already mentioned this, but I had Star Wars sheets. Now you're getting it twice. What a weird thing. But I do think I liked your argument a lot, Bob, that the Gremlins there's something like in the spirit of the Gremlins that could have only happened in the 80s. So I'm giving it to them.
Yeah, I can't remember what my original argument was. I am going with Gremlins here. And I think part of it is that Return of the Jedi, first of all, it doesn't stand alone by itself at all. It's like, is the whole Star Wars trilogy. That's a different argument, but that's also not fully 80s, right? That's 70s and 80s. As a standalone film between the two of them, I'm not going to say Gremlins is better, but I do think it is, as you pointed.
I think it is better.
I love Return of the Jedi. I don't like it as much as I like Empire, but I also think it's the most kid-friendly. I think I made this argument when we did this originally. That Return is the most kid-friendly. I'm still giving it to Gremlins, even though it is a quote-unquote horror film. It is still super cute, and I do think it is a child-palatable horror film. So for that reason, I'm giving it to Gremlins. Gremlins advances to the Final Four. Next up, it's 4-seed Muppets Take Manhattan versus 2-seed The Goonies. We're going to go reverse alphabetical order. Kate, you go.
Muppets and Goonies are two of my rising and star signs. I don't know what I'm even saying. But my Muppet movie is the original Muppet movie as my preferred one, and the Goonies is just like, I can't. It's my movie. It's perfect. I love it.
So that's a Goonies for you.
That's a Goonies. Yes.
Jim.
I'm gonna take your argument from the just previously about like Goonies is distinctly 80s, right?
Yeah.
Well, the Muppets, yes, there were some films there, but also they kind of fit throughout a lot of time. So I'm going to go with Goonies.
All right. Bren.
Basically the same exact argument. I love Muppets. I want to take a moment just to say there's maybe no cinematic image better than rats skating on a hot grill on butter. That said, Muppets falling back into that timelessness thing. Goonies could only exist in the 80s. It is the ultimate version of the ultimate 80s genre, kids on bikes. Goonies.
Yep. Absolutely. And Bob.
Oh shit! What? What is that? That is a mess, boys. Clean it up.
Oh shit! That's my mom's favorite part.
Hey guys, I'm going with Goonies.
Okay. I love the argument that 80s is the only time the Goonies could happen. And it's weird because today, and I don't know why it's happening today, but I've seen 2 articles today on Reddit about how a Goonies reboot is a terrible idea and it should never happen.
It's a terrible idea. It shouldn't happen.
I think that, again, it is so inextricably linked with that decade, and it has kids from the 80s, and it's a story for kids in the 80s. Therefore, it has to advance over Muppets Take Manhattan. And I love Muppets Take Manhattan. And I watched it. I didn't watch the whole thing, but parts of it leading up to this. And like Joan Rivers and Miss Piggy at the counter, just giving her the makeover. So you mentioned the rats on the griddle, and I think I've told the story before on the podcast about that scene making my brother violently ill at the drive-in. It's very, like, I have a lot of great memories of this film, but The Goonies is like now and forever my 80s kids film. So I say that, and we're about to get to another one of those that is now forever. So unanimous for the Goonies into the final 4. Speaking of now and forever 80s movies, One Seed, Never Ending Story versus Land Before Time. I'm going to start in the middle with Jim.
Just a couple days ago, I mentioned to my brother that we were recording this, and he was like, well, Never Ending Story won, right? Like, that was his response. So I think I'll vote for that for his sake. But they're both very distinct memories of this time period, but the Never Ending Story just goes on and on.
Although The Land Before Time also had 14 sequels, and so that also technically goes on and on and on.
That's true. It continues on.
But that story has an end. We know what happens.
It's a comet, yeah. All right, so let's go now to Bren. Where are you on this one?
I do, again, pour one last time, one out for Land Before Time, American Tail, all of those Don Bluth films of the 80s, but Neverending Story traumatized an entire generation in a way that we will all never heal or fully move on. So Neverending Story. Also, R.I.P. Wolfgang Peterson, who passed away in between since we last recorded.
Yeah.
Do we think it was the ghost of Wolfgang Peterson who stole the audio so we can talk about it?
Yes, I do now.
Yeah. R.I.P.
Legend.
Kate.
Never Ending Story. Wait, what is this even
Land
up against?
Before Time. Yeah.
Exactly.
No shade. But I was just a little older when that one came out, where I remember, I think I had one of the little like hand puppets from the Pizza Hut.
I remember those.
But yeah, no, Never Ending Story is one of the movies that made me fall in love with movies. And like, just even the opening, it's so European, right? It's so German. It looks totally different and still looks incredible because everything is practical. And that Lamal song, like it is not cheese. It is just pure joy. And it is joy. I love it.
Yeah. It's like, if a rainbow was a song, it would be that Lamal song, right?
Turn around. Yeah, it's so good.
Bob.
Anyway.
Well, this is now officially the second podcast this season where we've referenced Pizza Hut cinema tie-ins.
I look forward to the episode for Best Pizza Hut cinema tie-in.
Honestly, that's what I'm saying. We need to do a best fast food like tie-in product. Seriously.
I can get you, Matt Singer.
My very own Jolly.
It shouldn't be any surprise to anyone on this podcast or listening at this point that I'm going to choose the Neverending Story.
Yeah, and like nothing but respect for The Land Before Time, which is I don't remember if it's in the part that survived or not. But, that Diana Ross song is just like, it's still to this day I hear it and just weep openly weeping. It's so.
Were you still? I forget when I definitely sang that in chorus, but it might have been when the two of you were in like the junior senior high school. I might have sung it when I was in like sixth grade.
We sang it for my like sixth grade graduation. So the sixth grade graduation class was singing it. My mother was playing the piano. It was a very emotional moment because it's a brutal song. It's beautiful. I love it, but it's emotionally wreckage, right? What's more 80s than that? But what's more 80s than that? The Never-Ending Story. That's what's more 80s than that. That is like the encapsulation of the 80s in a film. I will say that between now and when we first recorded this, I actually had the misfortune of watching The Never-Ending Story 2.
Oh, no.
Sorry.
If you really want to appreciate the original Never-Ending Story, I recommend watching The Never-Ending Story 2. All respect to Jonathan Brandis. He was not the problem there. But my God, what a piece of shit that movie is. The Never-Ending Story is a brilliant, beautifully told movie that is effective and it's both filled with wonder and terror. That's the 80s.
Yeah. And it's pitched for kids in a way that doesn't talk down to them, which is what the problem with The Never-Ending Story 2 is. Like, it's like, I'm making a kids movie. And the first one is just like, I'm making a movie that is like a fairy tale and children can access it and feel it and understand it, but I am not changing how I present things to them because they're children. Like,
yeah, all that is true. But I will say the other thing that we realized was like it was such a blatant cash grab, and they could not bother to care. The plot makes no sense. The characters' actions make no sense. Nobody's doing anything, and like the Never-Ending Story has nonsensical elements. Don't get me wrong, but that's part of the story. Is like this is weird and none of it makes sense. But like people do things in the second one that you're just like, why would you do that? Like.
And like it is the second half of the book, which like goes off the rails a little bit. Like the first part of the book is just the story that gets Bastian to Fantasia, which I think is called Fantastica in the book. And that's the first movie, but that is sort of a complete thought, right? And it's sort of unfinishedness of what he does once he gets there. And then the second half of the book is like, oh, he gets there and he turns into a complete asshole.
Which is what happens in the second movie, yeah.
Yeah, but it's not well done. If that was one of the first movies that made me fall in love with movies, that was one of the first sequels that I was like, oh, Hollywood is a crock. Yeah. I was so excited to go see it, and I was like, this sucks.
Yeah, it's true.
Same.
Go ahead, Bob. You were going to say?
If you want to learn to appreciate The Never-Ending Story 2, though, you should watch The Never-Ending Story 3, starring that kid from Free Willy.
Wait, I don't think I even knew that existed. My God,
But it was direct to video, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Direct to VHS.
Yeah. One last comment on Never-Ending Story 2 is like you can encapsulate this, and actually this could go either way for you. The original Bastian's dad was played by Major Dad, and in the second movie, it's played by John Wesley Shipp, Dawson's Creek's Dawson.
Yeah, The Flash himself.
Yes,
Major Daddy.
Major Daddy. Which, your mileage may vary. Both of them highly bangable. But all right. That being said, that's our unanimous victory for Never-Ending Story. Before we get into the final four, we're going to take a quick break to visit Joan Rivers at the department store makeup counter. We will be right back after these messages. We are back with our final four 80s children's films. Hey, has anyone seen my horse? I left him right near the Swamps of Sadness. Artax? Anyone? Artax?
Bad news for you.
Bad news. Thank God I have horse insurance. Anyway, here's our final four. It is Who Framed Roger Rabbit versus Gremlins and Goonies versus The Never-Ending Story. I always like to take a step back and be like, oh, is this the final four that I anticipated? Not even remotely close. Not even within the realm of possibility, but it's the 80s. Anything can happen. Ronald Reagan became the president. Okay, so let's jump into this. Who Framed Roger Rabbit versus Gremlins? I'm going to go around the horn. I'm going to start with Bob. I can't imagine where you're going to vote here.
I'm picking Gremlins.
Okay, it's shocking. Mm-hmm. Brendan.
Gremlins all the way.
Jim.
It's funny. I think I haven't shown my kids Roger Rabbit, but I still think that's more of an 80s for me. So I'm going to go with Roger Rabbit.
Kate.
Roger Rabbit exploded into my brain at a tender age. I was so enchanted with it. I did not see Gremlins until I was in my 20s. So Roger Rabbit is my 80s movie, but I think I'm going to give it to Gremlins because I feel like Roger Rabbit is a little bit more of a 4-quadrant movie.
Mm-hmm.
And Gremlins feels a little more like it was like, this is a movie. It's still kind of like soft 4-quadrant, but it was like, it's a cartoon, right? It's a horror cartoon.
Are you remembering
so
Gremlins 2? That's a cartoon.
Oh, I love Gremlins
that
too.
That is absolutely.
I love Gremlins too. It's just so the people who may not understand what you're talking about. Can you explain what a 4-quadrant movie is?
4-quadrant movie. I don't know what the quadrants are, but they're sort of like the olds like it, the youngs like it, the like whatever. What are the 4 quadrants?
The teens like it. It's basically. I actually don't know myself, but it is basically like it's children, teens, adults, and elderly. I think, or at least the idea that it's a film that would play to all ages, all interests at any time.
So in 80s parlance, it's the Ferris Bueller of films. All the kids love him. We weirdos. I think it's the jocks, the losers. They think he's a righteous dude.
Oh, are you ready? Here are the 4 quadrants. Male and female, over and under 25. Dan.
Well, that's less exciting.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sorry, to recap, which one did you go with here?
Gremlins.
Okay. Bren, did I get your vote yet?
Yes, I'm in for Gremlins.
Jim?
I'll stick with Roger Rabbit, even though it's going to go down.
I may be with you on this one, Jim. I honestly cannot remember how I voted on this originally. I think I was very much on the Gremlins train when we were doing it because Brent had these really persuasive arguments, including but not limited to the fact that his family, whom I love, is financially dependent upon.
I mean, yeah, if you want to hurt the brand that's paying for my children's food, sure.
Right.
No, vote Roger Rabbit. That's fine.
Here's updated content. Maybe it'll get canceled by HBO Max.
Oh, God.
Way too close. Way too close.
He's
Only
fine.
because you said it, it's okay.
Prayer circle around Secrets of the Mogwai. Here's my only, I think the thing that I have going for Roger Rabbit, and I'm fine if it goes down here, is that from a cartoon experience, there was nothing else like it, and there has never been anything else like it, in that it brought together Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse all in one. Like, that is huge. It's massive.
That was huge. It was like,
and it was like a cultural moment.
Mm-hmm.
But does that make it a definitive 80s movie? I think one of the arguments we had previously was like the references that are in Roger Rabbit are more 1950s and earlier than they are 80s. It's not real. There's nothing about it that is singularly 80s.
It's a post-war film, really. Yeah.
Yeah. And there are no children except for the baby, who is arguably not a child.
Not a child.
Yeah.
Not a child.
Whereas Gremlins, I mean, I guess it doesn't have kids. I guess, is Gizmo kind of a kid?
Maybe, but I was going to say, I still think the whole structure... It's Corey Feldman, and it is structured as a kid's film, because it is structured as a boy and his dog movie.
Okay, I'm fine with it. So Gremlins does advance to the final 2.
I just need to know, was Flight of the Navigator a 4-quadrant film?
No,
No,
parents
it's a
don't
kids
give a
movie.
shit about that film.
Just want to be sure. Okay.
No reason.
I'm gonna type the question into Google and see what they tell me. Was Flight of the Navigator?
It's so weird. Google wrote back, what is Flight
What
of
is
the
Flight of the
Navigator?
Navigator? Exactly. I don't know her. It's just the Mariah Carey gift.
Jessica Parker is rolling in her grave right now.
All right, so that means Gremlins advances to final 2. Goonies versus Never Ending Story. This one is hard, and I do just distinctly remember the first time we did this. We went around, and I was like, "Okay, that's it. The winner is blank," and you're like, "No, it's not. That was final 4." I was like, "Oh shit," because this is a final 2 matchup. This is a final 2 matchup, not a final 4 matchup. I'm gonna start with the back of the order this time. Kate, where are you on this one?
I have to give it to Goonies. And I know that one of the arguments that was made previously, even though it was like a month and a half ago, is that Goonies it has sort of all of the like hallmarks: kids on bikes. You have Columbus, you have Richard Donner, you have Steven Spielberg, you have some titans of like big tentpole 80s culture making. You have stars, child actors from the 80s, Sean Astin, Corey Feldman, Brand Walsh, what's his
Josh
name?
Brolin.
Thanos. Thank you. And Martha Plimpton and Ke-Huy Quan, which I may be pronouncing his name incorrectly, and I apologize. But just like real like 80s kid superstars, sort of. And you have to have seen that movie as a kid in the 80s to fully appreciate and love it. So I just think that it exemplifies a type of commercial filmmaking. It exemplifies a type of kind of, screw the like fucking rich people who want it. All this land is for condos. Foreclosure is a definite, right? Like it has that to it too. It's just such a product of the 80s. And, I think the reason that you would never want to reboot it now is like, childhood is different now, right? Like it would be a different movie. Anyway, The Goonies, and that I love The Neverending Story with my whole heart, but The Goonies is the kids' movie.
Yeah. Jim,
I can't deny how much y'all love The Goonies, as well as my wife and a whole bunch of other people. I think I have to vote for that one.
but do you love it? And I genuinely want to know.
I was late to it. I was. I think. I think I just didn't grow up with it, but I can, in terms of it being an 80s movie that's iconic, absolutely.
Do your kids like it?
Yeah. They love it. And then, I think it's definitely, the adventure of it is a lot of fun. And I've grown to love it myself too. But I mean, I know where Bob's going to vote, is what I have to say about that.
You might not know that.
That's true.
Brendan, have your kids watched Goonies?
I haven't shown them it yet. I think, not sure why actually. I sometimes adventure stuff with real people, like there's a higher tolerance usually for animated. So, although again, Gremlins has gone over well. There's been a few things now, so I think we might be ready to go into that. Because I would think, I'm trying to think age-wise, I think just a year older than them when it was in theaters and I saw it. So, right in that same range.
Yeah. I saw it. How old
6.
are your kids? 6? Yeah, I saw it around 6 or 7. And there's like some scary skeleton stuff and Carol, but like
actually the opening is the thing I think that makes me most concerned on showing it to them.
Where he like
fake hanging. Yeah. Like once you get past that, I'm even tempted like maybe just start after that, and that could be a fun surprise for them later in life. That's how it opens.
Yeah. You really think I'd be stupid enough to kill myself? I do love
his shrug. Robert Davi's shrug is great. I don't want to rob my kids of that.
There is the corpse in the ice cream freezer as well. Let's not forget that. Okay, so I was just curious because I know my niece and nephew also, when they were around that age, also loved the movie. And they have no interest in anything from the 1980s, but they still love the movie. So that's 2 for Goonies. Bran, where are you?
I'm actually with Goonies also, and it goes back to it's the weird thing we've used against a bunch of things that I love, but I'm just going to go again. The timelessness, like Neverending Story, you could have made maybe not the practical effects and the look and the awesome song. That's very tied to the 80s, but the story itself could exist anytime. Going back to, again, Goonies could only exist in the 80s, like just that brand of kid adventure. So I'm going to go Goonies just for exemplifying what an 80s kids movie is.
Bob?
I feel like I'm babysitting, but I'm not getting paid. So two movies that I absolutely love, and if I were to pick a personal preference to this pairing, again, it's a final 2, right? That's really what this, in my mind, it should have been.
Yeah.
If I was going to pick a personal preference film, as much as I love Goonies, I'm going to watch The Neverending Story before I ever watch the Goonies. I watch them both probably, several times a year, but it's probably never. I just watched Neverending Story the other night. When I go to bed, like I'll just put it on. And so they're both really important films, and they're very similar to me in a lot of ways, that they're both children having kind of like big fun adventures that you only wish you could have as a child. Right. But the Goonies is a little bit more grounded in reality, to that point. I think that, to the point Kate made earlier, and I think I made it the first time around too, The Neverending Story is not talking down to kids in any way. I mean, you have Rockbiter with those great moments of just like, they were such big, strong hands, right?
Good Rockbiter, by the way.
What's that?
I said good rock biter impression, by the way.
Oh, I do a good rock biter too. I also do a good Wallace Shawn. Apparently, if you listen to the best Clueless episode.
But can you do Wallace Shawn as the rock?
No, I can't. Let me work on that. I'll come back next season. But it doesn't talk down to kids. It introduces kids to a fantasy adventure. There's just for me on a personal level, like the otherworldly, beyond fantasy, like that sort of stuff, what speaks to me. But I think that Goonies is that film that is that knee jerk for everybody who, for a lot of people, let's say, that will say, well, what's like the best 80s kids film? People probably knee jerk to Goonies pretty easily because it sticks in their brains so well. I also was thinking as we were going through these conversations, Jim brought up a point with regards to his kids seeing Goonies, and I was part of that experience of being able to see Goonies with his children, and that was the movie I wanted to show them first before Neverending Story, right? I haven't thought to myself, I need to show them Neverending Story, because I think it's more of a personal preference to me than me saying that everybody's going to love this. Although, Jim, can I show the kids Neverending Story at some point?
I showed them the trailer recently, and they're like, yeah, that's okay.
Okay, we have a problem. I need to talk to them about that. So, long story short, I'm picking Goonies for this.
But also, don't forget that Neverending Story begins with the RTAC stuff, and that is really hard for kids to watch now.
Yeah.
Like, we were a hardier stock. We were like programmed to understand that life is terrible and you will die. And I feel
Life's
like
not fair.
kids are like, no, I'm not down with that. Like, I'm actually like, it's a social justice thing. Justice for our tax is what I'm trying to say. But okay, so that's 4 for Goonies. I'm going to make it a 5 for Goonies. I absolutely adore The Neverending Story. It is, to me, right up there, probably the most successful child fantasy film I've ever seen. And there were some great fantasy films in the 80s. There really were.
If I could say, I'm not sure, Brandon, if they could do it now and have it be as iconic as it was. They probably would do a successful job at it, just kind of like just as successful as the Harry Potter films are. But I think, I don't know. I don't know as though it would imprint as well if they made it today, because I think it's more about like grinding out the franchise type of stuff today than versus making the Wolfgang Peterson clearly was passionate about making this project.
Had a vision,
yes, correct, right? Yeah. And it was a vision for children. And I don't know as though people really do that anymore.
Well, they do, but on a 10th of the budget or internationally.
Yep. True. True.
You would not get practical effects now, for sure. And I think
that is a quintessential 80s thing, the practical effects, and they are amazing in this movie and a lot of other movies. Sloth is great, right?
Oh my God, Sloth. All of Labyrinth. No, it's no, you see those few and far between. Again, there's definitely people making them. I feel like there are two very wonderful, although I guess they're leaning a little bit more Amblin. It's like, of all places, Netflix tends to put out 1 or 2 movies a year that are like really great. Like, oh my God, this is like a perfect kids family movie that at least kind of aspires to that range, but they're all made for a 10th of the budget and have much more of a, I don't know, it's the vibe is right, but it's not going to have the scale of Neverending Story.
Yeah.
And by
it's a scale question, right? The scale of that film, and it's about creative experience, right? Like narrative encounters with stories.
That's the one I will say that comes closest. I highly recommend Night Books on Netflix if you've seen it, with Kristen Ritter and otherwise all kids. It is far and away the closest I've seen to like a Labyrinth, or again, close. It reminds me more of Labyrinth than Neverending Story, but totally in that kind of 80s vein. Super fun. I recommend it especially for like kids. If your kids are like probably ages 8 and up, it's like a great kind of like entryway again into like something like a Halloween movie of sorts for that age.
Cool. That sounds cool. That's another good episode we should do, fun. Which is like best like kids films on Netflix, like original. So someone put that in the ideas channel in our Discord. But that gives us a final 2 of Gremlins versus the Goonies. And so let's go around the horn. We're going to start with Bob. Who are you voting for?
I think at the end here, it's going to be the Goonies, because it's not the horror movie and it's the adventure you could have.
while you were running away from the mob family.
Yeah. Follow them size 5s.
Follow them size 5s. Bren, where are you?
I'm going to take my quick little moment just on. I'm so happy that it actually, because I do think the final 2 is different last time. So I'm glad it came down to this. Because I think, it's Amblin, for me, Amblin is 80s. Like, they made the best kids movies. I think this was in the part that got lost, but something I just wanted to say again is what I love about 80s Amblin kids movies is it's a kid's world with adult stakes. Like, these really were just like, it's a very specific vibe that so rarely is captured this well. So yeah, to me, 80s has to be Amblin, and these two I could not be happier with this being the final 2. As much as, look, Gremlins and Goonies were probably 2 of my most rented videos of the 80s. As much as I don't want to take away anything from, again, the brand that employs me, Goonies. I do think Goonies is still, like you just said, Bob, it really is. That's the universal adventure in Goonies. Also, by the way, love that both films are both kind of against capitalism and all the other 80s greed that you see in so many other movies.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Raise those kids right.
Isn't it funny, though, that like kids like us who grew up in the 80s are now dealing with like our parents are the ones who are now like the ones draining our resources, like locusts? Like, did they not get the memo while they were watching these movies? Anyway, that's a different podcast. Jim.
That is.
Oh, yeah. And I think also thinking about these 2 films with each other, as you started, Eric, talking about kind of not problematic, but like some difficult things for kids to swallow. We got Gremlins and Goonies both have a lot of those elements there, as many of these other films do too. First of all, I want to say I kind of want to vote for Gremlins because I feel really bad about that HBO Max joke I made, Brendan.
You can just pay me back by canceling any subscription to Discovery. Like anybody else's, doesn't even have to be your own.
Okay, sounds good.
I canceled mine.
There you go.
Wonderful. But I think I like the argument, the idea that Goonies is like an adventure that a kid could have. It's aspirational of like what a kid thinks it might be like, and it kind of fits that what an 80s kid was thinking at that time of like, oh yeah, that's what reality is like. So I think that's a good fit. So the Goonies is my vote.
And Kate.
Goonies never say die.
Goonies never say die. So that is a clean sweep. There you have it, folks. Our pick for the best 1980s children's film is The Goonies. Do you agree? Do you think we need to write up Troy's bucket? Tell us how you really feel by leaving a comment on this episode at greatpopculturedebate.com or find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube. While you're there, make sure you subscribe and follow the podcast so you can hear more about the debates coming up, vote in open polls, and even decide which topics we tackle next. I want to say thank you to my panel. It's still our time down here. And thank you for listening. If you loved what you heard, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where you can get even more exclusive content and you get episodes a whole day early. We hope you have a good one, and remember, everyone is entitled to their wrong opinions. Kids suck.